Good morning. I believe I missed very good sessions yesterday. Uh, so I will stay the whole day and try and listen to everybody today, I promise. But, you know, as also thank you to the IDSA for inviting me to speak here today on one of my favorite issues, which is actually South Asia and China in South Asia. Um, the one of the reasons that I think that in India-China relations, the sub-region of South Asia is very significant, is because the essential trust deficit in India-China relations is actually rooted in security concerns in South Asia. Many of the trust deficit, much of the trust deficit is actually linked to security issues which are nested in South Asia and in the IOR region, the Indian Ocean region. And many of these, of course, are familiar to people who are looking at India's policy vis-a-vis China. The boundary question, the settlement of the Tibet issue, which is linked to the boundary question in my estimation. China's political and military investment in Pakistan, which haunts this relationship. China's very different understanding of terrorism in South Asia. And of course, China's emerging South Asia policy, or its definition of its new South Asia policy. And unless many of these issues are actually addressed between India and China, it's going to be very difficult to actually sustain cooperation on either regional or global issues. One of the problems that I think India and China have in their relationship is that we posit dialogue over policy. We have any number of dialogues, joint group meetings, joint dialogues on the economy, on terrorism, on the border, and yet we really have had, in the last 20 years or 25 years, when these dialogues have been initiated, very little policy on aspects of our relationship. Dialogue is generally deemed to be open-ended. It's easy to shift the goalposts, and it assumes an absence of consensus and binding commitments. So there are actually no actionable issues that are posited in a dialogue. And the very fact that we have a number of dialogues and really no effective policy related to China on many of the security issues is one of the major problems in India-China policy going forward. A policy is, as I assume, sort of assumes its consensus. It's a committed position, and it actually spells out actionable issues. On global issues, it's very interesting. We have a broad consensus, and therefore we have actually cooperative policies. On regional issues and sub-regional issues, we have no consensus, and therefore we don't have any actionable policies. One of the issues, of course, is that in our bilateral relations, both of us are actually geared to the maximization of power, of influence, and of national power in particular. So therefore, there's very little consensus on the way in which we view security issues. And therefore, we really have to think very clearly between the two of us whether we need to cooperate and what is the need to cooperate in our relationship. The reason I say this is because we talk, the rhetoric in India-China relations is that of a cooperative partnership. The rhetoric, of course, belies the fact that there is actually on the ground very little cooperation that is happening in the core security issues that affect India in South Asia. I have a list of priorities in India-China relations on the thing for you. And as you can see, most of the list of priorities for India and for China, many of these are similar. But of course, the meanings that we attach to them are entirely different. Many of these on the Chinese side are extremely troubling for India. Nuclearization, for example. The cooperation on the maritime Silk Route is another one. Opposing third-party interventions is a third one. These are troubling for India in terms of the implications for India's influence, for India's interests, and for India's presence in various regions in South Asia, as well as in the IOR region. The interesting part, of course, is that uh, since both countries come from national security positions and maximization of power positions, very rarely do we see, very rarely do we actually agree on how to deal with these issues. In nuclearization, for example, the Chinese position is to balance Pakistan with India on nuclear positions in South Asia. This is extremely troubling in the Indian context because I think India makes a distinction between responsible nuclear powers and non-responsible nuclear powers. The Chinese, of course, are extremely sorry. Should we go? That's all you have?
Yeah, that's all.
Not possible. Not possible. No. No, it's okay. It's okay. So just shut this off. Hello? Hello? इसको बंद कर दीजिए. इसको हटा दीजिए. I'm sorry, the rest of it hasn't come through, but it doesn't matter. The problem, as I said, is the way in which we look at many of these issues differently. Nuclearization, of course, as I said, is very problematic for India. At least China's policy on nuclearization is very problematic for India, as is China's policy on terrorism, or at least its view of terrorism. And I think one of the reasons that the view on terrorism is problematic is because China defines terrorism differently. For China, there has been a reluctance to actually look at terrorism as emanating from Pakistan, whereas that's where India looks at terrorism. That's a significant aspect of India's understanding of terrorism. Most recently, I think China has agreed that to accept the UN's resolution on listing certain outfits in Pakistan as terrorist outfits, but that's a very, very recent, situation. On the whole, China has generally ignored the fact that terrorism comes from Pakistan, and when quizzed, Chinese interlocutors will often tell you that if India had better relations with Pakistan, terrorism would disappear. It wouldn't be a problem for India. I think this is a very short-sighted, one-dimensional view of the issue of terrorism in South Asia, which is the security issue for India in South Asia. On third-party disputes or interventions in South Asia, China is, of course, wary of American presence in South Asia. I think from the Indian perspective, there has always been third-party intervention in South Asia. America has been in South Asia for a very long time, as has China, since the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and also, of course, since 9/11. So, in a sense, that reality is something I think we have accepted, whether we welcome that or not. For the Chinese, this has become increasingly troublesome because of India's more robust diplomacy abroad and the fact that India has begun to transcend the constraints of being in South Asia by linking to other states outside of South Asia. The current drift towards the US, for example, has China extremely worried about how this will impinge on being able to deal with India in South Asia. The interesting part, of course, is that in many ways India has seen South Asia as its neighborhood and China has looked at it as its periphery. In terms of periphery policy, China has viewed its periphery as something as a location, a site of threat to its regime and to the nation. For a long time, therefore, China's policy in South Asia was something that looked at being able to contain conflict and prevent crises in South Asia. That policy has begun to change, and with that, I think India-China relations in South Asia have also begun to change. China has developed now a policy for South Asia, in which it looks at India and Pakistan as the two pillars of that policy. India as an economic partner, Pakistan as a strategic partner. I think the intrinsic contradiction of that is not apparent to the Chinese. The fact that India will partner China on the economy and Pakistan will be the strategic partner raises all kinds of fears and anxieties within India about how to deal with that situation. So in a sense, even the new South Asia policy that China envisages and is developing now does not actually de-link it from using Pakistan as a strategic partner in South Asia. I think that constitutes one of the major contradictions in China's policy in South Asia, and a major contradiction on the basis of which I think the trust deficit will be sustained over a very long period of time. The other thing, of course, is that China has also begun to rejig its policies with other South Asian states by actually expanding its trade, its investment, its commerce, and to a large extent, therefore, Asian states have begun to have much more autonomous diplomatic relationships with China. What this essentially has done is raise fears about a much more China-centric economic framework for South Asia than the currently India-centric framework for South Asia. Now, the whole debate on China-centric and India-centric, therefore, now has come home to South Asia in many ways. If you look at the figures on trade and investment, soft power aid to South Asian states, it's very clear that many of the investments that China has made are welcomed. They actually sustain local economies, they grow local economies, and they are investments that link China in physical ways as well to the Chinese economy and to the Chinese mainland, whether it's the roads or the ports or the trade, the new Silk Road, maritime Silk Route, or the territorial, the land Silk Route. These are all ways in which there's a physical connectivity now with the Chinese state and the Chinese economy, and a China-centered Southeast Asia, East Asia economy. The interesting part, of course, is that the concern that Indians have, I think India has, is whether in fact South Asia is actually slipping away from India. I think studies do show us, however, that there is a good light, there's a good side to this, which is that China's trade expansion into South Asia is not at the expense of India. And though while the trade gap between China and South Asian states is narrowing, India is not really at the receiving end of this. India still has the amount of trade it has with South Asia, and what constrains India's expansion of trade with South Asian countries is actually its own economy and the very low level at which its economy functions today. So in a sense, India needs to grow its economy to be able to actually revive the India centricity of the South Asian regional economies as a whole. On the other hand, though, we do find, as a consequence of the rejigging of the relationship with other South Asian states, China has moved from a notion of South Asia as periphery to South Asia as neighborhood. I think Xi Jinping made that observation when he came to Delhi last year, when he actually said, we are in South Asia, we have stakes in South Asia and interests in South Asia, and India and China together can actually develop South Asia. So in the sense, that partnership that he wants with India in South Asia is actually symbolic of the way in which China now perceives South Asia as a region in which to invest, a region that will actually contribute to China's own development and rejuvenation, as the Chinese say. That, I think, is indicative of the fact that China is not now looking at South Asia merely in an instrumentalist way, but China is actually looking at South Asia as a region in which it wants to have long-term stakes. If that is true, then I think India has to rethink the premises of its China policy in South Asia, and also have to rethink what its interests are, and whether in fact cooperation is an option with China in South Asia. On the issue of cooperation, I think states cooperate when cooperation actually allows them to meet certain objectives. So the question that comes up is, will cooperation or the choice for cooperation actually allow India to meet certain objectives? One of the objectives, of course, is economic development, economic growth, but the other security objectives are the ones that actually are the niggling ones, the ones that actually worry the Indians. Will cooperation with China actually help India to resolve the border issue? Will it actually help India to also resolve the Tibetan issue, which is central to the border issue? Will it actually help India to deal with the Pakistan issue, which is at the core of India's security concerns in South Asia? And will it actually also help India to, in a sense, sustain its position in the Indian Ocean region? I think these are all of the questions that need to be addressed if the options for cooperation have to be taken into on board. Now, whether in fact that actually happens, whether in fact cooperation with China actually meets these objectives, can be judged from the fact, from the reality of cooperation in the past. I think if you look at the period from 1954 onwards, Panchsheel, the 1954 agreement, thereafter all of the agreements on CBMs, on political guidelines, on resolution of the border have actually all fallen by the way, right? None of them has actually worked. We saw the last agreements on the border, on CBMs, on political guidelines and all of that, just actually disintegrating in 2013 and 2014 when the Chinese dug in their heels in Ladakh. And thereafter there was a proposal to put in new mechanisms and new arrangements to deal with the border. I think this is one of the problems that we have, which is that we have these agreements which are on set out on the basis of dialogues. These are open-ended, there is no commitment to these, and therefore the goalposts keep changing. And I think one of the questions it raises is whether in fact cooperation with China has worked in the past, right? I think to a large extent there is a feeling in India that cooperation with China only works if India has leverage elsewhere. Okay? If India has leverage in its diplomacy with the United States or with Japan, then cooperation with China will work. So the pattern of cooperation and coercion, or cooperation and competition, seems to be moving along in some sort of a tango. Now that itself, I think, is indicative how deep the trust deficit is, right? And that is also indicative of why the trust deficit can never actually decline, will not actually decline in the near future, unless both China and India rethink the premises of their foreign policy or their actions in South Asia. I think for China, it's very evident, it's very clear that I think it needs to look at this dual pillar policy in South Asia that it has just announced, right? Can it actually work through the contradictions of economic cooperation with India and strategic cooperation with Pakistan, right? Is this a relevant policy? Is this a logical policy for China to have in South Asia, given the history of India-Pakistan relations, given the history of terrorism in India, and given the fact that to a large extent there are state institutions in Pakistan that do not want a stable relationship with India? I think China needs to actually actively think about this rather than tell Indian interlocutors that your problem with terrorism will disappear if you have better relationships with Pakistan. So in a sense, I think what needs to be done is, rather than these open-ended dialogues, we need to really have at a policy level much more direct, frank, transparent negotiations, actual negotiations with China on some of these specific security issues that relate to Indian security interests in South Asia, strategic interests in South Asia. Much of this, I think, has not happened in the past, except in a very limited fashion between external affairs and external affairs, foreign ministries. I think the relationship with China is so wide open today that we cannot actually limit it just to interaction between foreign ministry officials. I think it has to be opened up to experts, it has to be opened up to technical people who actually can deal with the specific intricacies of issues on the ground and put these on the table. In a sense, I think what has happened is that we have left, and I think I agree with the Professor Buzan, that we need to have a foreign service that is more diplomatically competent, has more expertise, and includes also, I think, within its framework, people who actually have the expertise to discuss specific issues on the ground with China, whether it's the economy, whether it's water in the environment, whether it's terrorism, whether it is national security. I think the generalists will no longer do in this current situation. And finally, I really do want to talk about what are India's options in this situation, right? I think that there is no harm if India drives a hard bargain on many of the issues that concern its core security interests. I think on terrorism, it is worth telling China, it is worth talking to Beijing on the fact that Pakistan constitutes a problem and that a strategic partnership with Pakistan will not further China's cooperative relationships with India at any level, right? I think it is also worth for India to look at its own economic policies and figure out where it needs to go and what it needs to do in terms of actually creating an economic community in South Asia. I think we have tended far too long to look merely at national growth figures and GDP figures without actually figuring out whether we do have a scope for a regional economy. SAARC is dead, so is SAFTA, but I think there may be other avenues for pushing this forward. Finally, I think we need to actually have a dialogue with China on Tibet. This is a touchy problem. For example, I mean, China is likely to say, and in all regards, will say that Tibet is an internal issue, and yet Tibet is not an internal issue for China. We have the Dalai Lama in India. We also have a large refugee Tibetan population in India. We have the prospect of the demise of the Dalai Lama and a whole host of issues that arise out of that, which will actually impact adversely on India-China relations. Because there will be accusations and counter-accusations that will fly as a consequence of that. And I think that situation needs to be avoided. We need to have some kind of a negotiation, with China on the Tibet issue. And finally, I think we need to confront China with this whole nuclearization situation, where China's position on nuclearization in South Asia is to balance India with Pakistan. I think the issue of responsible nuclear powers has to actually be put on the table, and at the risk of causing fatigue, discourse fatigue. I think the notion that the reality or the fact that China is responsible for Pakistan nuclearization, which may actually fall into terrorist hands, given the vulnerability of Pakistani institutions, needs to be brought home to China. I think these are many of the things that we don't talk to China about anymore because we have spoken about them so long that we think they need not be said anymore. But I think they do need to be said, and yes, I'm done. And for China, I think, as I said, I think it's a strategic mistake, a vastly strategic mistake, to have a dual pillar policy in South Asia. Thank you.